Hey guys, right now we're going to continue our consonant discussion, and we're going to be talking about manner. This is going to be a little bit longer than the last two lectures, so make sure you have a cup of coffee or something to keep yourself awake. There's a lot of information in this one, so let me share my screen. Yeah. Okay. All right. So manner of articulation is what this lecture is going to be about. Just a little reminder, we're talking about consonants and we talked about place of articulation, so the articulators, our lips and our tongue in the last, and our hard palate, soft palate in the last lecture. Now we're going to talk about manner, and manner is really where we're talking about how the airflow is constricted. Okay, so it's represented on the vertical dimension of the IPA chart, as I mentioned in the first lecture. And when we think of this as future speech therapists, manner is often describing the types of phonological errors that children are making. So, for example, stopping is a phonological error, and that's when children substitute a stop for other sounds. So we talked about this a little bit in the last lecture as well, because when we're talking about the IPA consonant chart, it's not two separate charts. It's not a place chart and a manner chart. It's all in one place. But it's helpful just to see how you're going to be coming across these terms again. So you'll hear about stopping. So when we talk about stops today, just remember that that is a manner in the chart, but stopping is itself an error that children make. We also often treat with certain disorders an entire class of sounds or category. In this case, for example, if we're treating a child who has a lateral lisp where the air escapes the sides of their tongue, we often treat the entire group of sounds, the entire manner that's affected by that. So in this case, when they have a lateral lisp, it'll affect all the fricatives and affricates, which we're going to talk about what that means in a minute. So it's just helpful for you to understand how this translates into our fields. Okay, as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about the vertical part of our chart here. So you'll see stops, fricatives, affricates, nasals, lateral sounds, rhotic sounds, and glides. You'll also see that these are grouped into two different categories here, obstruents and sonorants. And we're going to talk about what that means as we go through the presentation. Okay. So all sounds are created through airflow going through the vocal tract. Manner is describing how that airstream or airflow is modified. Okay. So how narrowly it's constricted. Is it completely blocked, as in the case of a stop, or as we move down that vertical axis, it becomes more and more open. We also make a distinction between whether the oral cavity is closed off or the nasal cavity is closed off. The nasal cavity is only referring to three sounds, the n, and ing. All right. Just another picture of our supralaryngeal vocal tract. And again, we're talking about how the airflow is constricted along this tract. So the first manner we're going to talk about is stops. As I talked about earlier, stops are learned very early in development, and stopping as a phonologic process is very common in young children. Stop refers to complete closure, complete constriction. So if we're talking about oral stops, the velum is raised and no air is going through the nose. It's only going through the oral cavity. That air pressure builds up and explodes when it's released. So you'll sometimes see these sounds referred to as plosives. Okay, so that's really interchangeable with stops, although not all these sounds are going to have a plosive burst depending on where they are when they're produced in a word. So for example, if you say the word cat, you don't get a burst at the end as you would if it was at the beginning of the word, okay? Also, if you're saying it in a consonant cluster, you're not going to have that same plosive explosion quality. Nasals are not in the stops category, okay? They're not in the stops manner, they're their own manner, but they are essentially a type of a stop, but instead of the air going through the oral cavity because of the obstruction, the air is going through the nasal cavity, okay? All right, so in a stop, the articulators are blocking airflow, nasal airflow, we're talking about most stops, well, stops actually. Nasal airflow is blocked. The air pressure builds up, the articulators move, this is called the release, and then there may be a burst. As we just mentioned, there's not always a burst depending on where it's produced. This happens very, very quickly. So stops are also very short. And your book did a really nice job of showing what it looks like on a spectrogram. And we've been playing with my little spectrogram app every week in our class time when we meet. And if you were seeing it on that spectrogram, it would be a short burst of energy. All right. So these are the sounds p, b, t, d, k, g, and then the glottal, as in like uh-oh. Remember when you're practicing and learning this, when you're trying to remember it, do not say the letters, okay? It's really good practice to get used to referring these by their sounds. So don't look through this and say P, B, T, D. Try and get used to saying it by the sound, okay? And the reason I say that is because, again, there's not always a one-to-one correspondence between the orthographic letter and then the symbol. All right. As I mentioned, there's only 3 nasals, m, n, and in the English language. So you can do this. You can pause the recording or do it later and practice identifying which words in these rows have stops. Okay, let's talk about fricatives. So stops, there was complete closure. Fricatives, the closure is not complete. So the fricatives, when a fricative is made, air is passing through a narrow passage. Okay, so that it creates noise, like a hissing sound. So if you think of it has a hissing quality to it, right? Fricatives and affricates are part of a group that's called stridents because of their noisy quality. All right. Now, how loud or intense these are depends on their place of articulation. So right now we're talking about manner, but remember along the other axis is place of articulation. So the noisiest fricatives are called sibilants. So sometimes people will use strident and sibilant interchangeably, but actually they're not. So strident is a larger category. Sibilant is a smaller subcategory for these very noisy sounds. So z, sh, and j. Okay. S and z are sometimes called groove fricatives. And your book talked about this because there's a midline groove formed in the tongue when you make those sounds. Just a reminder that the letter S has morphemic value. it's also a very important sound because it's often used in consonant clusters, and we use a lot of consonant clusters in English. So just something to be aware of. It's a very important sound. It's a frequently occurring sound in the English language because it has so much other grammar value, let's say. Okay, so this is an example of all the fricatives that we're studying. So again, th, as in thin, and then I like to, an example that I like to use to remember these two, the th sounds, is bath and bathe. You can, and if you put your hand on your vocal cords, you can feel the difference. So if you say bath, and then you say bathe, you feel your vocal cords vibrating for that second one, right? So I just like, that helps me remember the difference between them. And then the other sounds are s, z, sh. And then this one is kind of a tricky one. So often we see it in the medial position. J, it's a very, very soft sound, right? I mean, we're talking about sibilants, but this one is kind of unique, right? It's not a very commonly occurring sound in English. So in this example, it's at the beginning, genre. I think of it more like a French sound, actually. If anybody knows French, you hear this sound in French. And then the as in high. All right. So again, you can, at your leisure, either pause the video or when you, after you've watched all the videos, go back and practice identifying which words have fricatives in them. Okay. Affricates, I mentioned before that fricatives and affricates are all part of this group called stridents because of their noisy quality. So affricates are really like a stop and a fricative together. And if you look at the IPA symbols for them, it looks like two symbols, right? However, it really just represents one sound. So don't think of it as a t and a sh coming together and you're transcribing it as a t and a sh. But the quality of it is like a stop and a fricative. So affricates are these also noisy sounds. There's only two. So these start like a stop. Okay, so complete closure, but then there's some airflow that happens and causes that friction that we saw or heard about in the fricatives, right? So again, even though it's represented with two symbols here, it is one sound. Okay. Don't get too bogged down in the International IPA chart. The International IPA chart does not have them as a separate row, but we have them as a separate row. You're going to learn about them separately. When we are working as a speech therapist, we always treat them as separate sounds, okay? As you could see, what I just mentioned, you won't see an affricate line or row in the International Phonetic Alphabet chart, but you will see it in ours. Okay. So I don't think I gave you examples of, we don't have examples of words here, but the sounds are ch and j, like in jog, or ch and chip. Okay. So this is important to not get confused with the symbol that's for ya, which we haven't talked about yet. That looks like a J. So the symbol that looks like a small J is for the ya sound, but the sound that we associate with the letter J, J, is this symbol, this affricate symbol, okay? So again, in words like job, so that J. All right, so let's, so as I mentioned before, these are sibilants. Now, the j sound, also not to get confused, is sometimes orthographically represented with a G. And lots of times when kids are learning to read, this gets them tripped up. This is one of the biggest problems I'm having with helping my student who has dyslexia. She constantly gets mixed up between j and g. So the example that you saw before was a word that was written with the G letter, but makes the j sound. So for example, gerund, right? It's not g as in go, it's j. So I would spend some time kind of working through that and really memorizing that symbol for the sound, okay? So that you don't get these mixed up. All right. Just want to mention, as we just went through the fricatives and affricates, manner is very important when we talk about hearing loss. So as future speech therapists, I don't know if you've had any kind of explanation in any of your courses about audiology, but manner is very important in hearing loss because these high-pitched sounds, so if you look at this audiogram that was taken, this is what an audiogram would be, kind of a picture of somebody's hearing. So you could see it's organized by pitch. So low pitch, mid-range pitch, and high pitch. So as you can see, vowels are low pitched, but these sounds, so for example, these are high pitched sounds, okay? And this, we call this the speech banana, because it kind of looks like the shape of a banana. Often when someone has hearing loss, these high pitched sounds are the first ones that they start having trouble hearing, okay? So when someone has a hearing test, they will look at how well they can hear different sounds at different decibels. And if someone has a hearing loss, so this is here, the decibels that would identify hearing loss. So if they had to keep making, if they had to keep making the sound louder and louder for someone to hear it during a hearing test, that would indicate the level of their hearing loss. But you'll see, even with a mild hearing loss, someone may have trouble hearing these sounds. So this is just something to be aware of for your future work, and trying to figure out how this kind of fits in to what we know. So that's where manner really kind of overlaps even with audiology, okay? Liquids and glides, we're going to talk about these next. And these are considered vowel-like. So we went from stops where it's completely obstructed, and now we're way, way, way down to more air flowing. Not as much as vowels, but much more so than with the stops. So these have very vowel-like qualities. If you try and make the l sound, it's similar, your tongue is in a similar position as it is for the vowel O. So O, L, O, L, you could feel, right, where it is, okay? Glides are often substituted for liquids, okay? So this is also important when we're figuring out, well, where does manner fit into our job as a speech therapist? And I have glides instead of glides. I'll have to fix that. There's actually an error pattern called gliding. And what that means is children will substitute a glide for a liquid. And this is very, very, very common among young children. So instead of saying rabbit, they'll say wabbit and substitute the glide for the liquid. Okay, and I'm sure you've heard young kids do this. So the liquids are the L and the sound. So as with all these sounds that we're talking about, all the oral sounds, the velum is closed, but there's free passage of air happening along the tongue. So if we're talking about the lateral sound, so the tongue tip is making its closure at the alveolar ridge, and the air is moving laterally. So words like long, lice, right? This is a very unique articulation movement. So for other sounds, the sides of the tongue are often braced against your molars. So other sounds, other lingual sounds, except for this sound. So this is one that's sometimes harder to remediate because it is so different from other sounds. And your book talked about that a little bit. The rhotic liquid is the sound. Is in rice, around, America. So we're going to talk about this sound in a minute because it is the most commonly treated sound for kids who are in speech therapy at school age. It is very difficult to remediate. So there's many different versions of how you can make this sound. We know from vowels that we have rhotic vowels, right? So that can be confusing. There's two main ways of producing the sound, with a bunched tongue position or with a retroflex tongue position. We're not going to get into great detail about that in this class, but be aware that you may be aware, try and make yourself aware when you make the sound, where is your tongue? It's a late developing sound, but it's also a frequently occurring sound. And it is definitely affected by dialect. So my daughters go to school in Boston, so if you want to take a break and watch this funny video for comic relief, it's a good example of what happens to, we call it vowelizing, that the sound is no longer, it becomes like a vowel, especially at the end of words in Boston. So you can listen to that. Okay, so we talked about liquids, laterals, and rhotic, and now we're going to talk about glides. So glides are also considered more vowel-like among the consonants. They don't form the nucleus, but they have a more open vocal tract. So as I mentioned before, don't get confused with this symbol. It is not for the letter J. It is not for the J sound. It is for Y, even though it looks like a J. So this sound has a high front tongue position similar to E. So you make E, and E, E, E. So sometimes we'll use that vowel to shape this sound. As the book mentioned, it always precedes a vowel. Sometimes it gets transcribed after a non-palatable consonant, so a word like cute, k, and then yeah, oot, cute. Now, if some of you are teachers or had experience helping someone with literacy, or you just remember when you were taught to read, we said, what are the vowels? E, I, O, U, and sometimes Y. Don't get confused, because in this case, we are not referring to this as a vowel, okay? In IPA, it's not acting as a vowel. In reading, it does act as a vowel. But if we were transcribing a word, so if we had a word like baby, that Y letter at the end, which may be acting as a vowel in that syllable, would be transcribed as the symbol for that, for the high E vowel, right? Hopefully that didn't confuse you more, but I just want to make sure that you're aware, because these are the type of things that get folks tripped up. They'll say, wait, isn't Y a vowel? Yes, in reading it is, but not in IPA. Okay. Then we have the wa sound. This is an early developing sound. Uh, or rounded lips. So this is a very visual sound. We talked about how labial sounds are learned often first. They're easy to see when someone is producing them. Rounded lips make it a labial sound. So what. Um, Now I said that this is a sound that kind of really has two descriptors for it, right? So we talk about it being labial, but we also talk about it being velar because the tongue is in a velar position. So similar to that high back vowel, ooh, ooh. You can even see my lips rounding for ooh, right? Okay. So it's important as you're looking through this to think about it in broad category terms. Okay. So when we talk about phonology, we're talking about how sound share some type of feature. And often when we're picking targets, therapy, we will look at this very broad category when we're trying to remediate speech sounds. So um, I'm not going to get into too much detail about this now. It's just important to understand that we are categorizing them because there's certain rules in where we make sounds. And I talked about that in the first lecture. I think it's helpful to look at that chart that's in the book um, because that will also help you when you're doing your transcription. So classes of sounds, we talk about oral versus nasal. We're going to talk in the next lecture about voiced and voiceless. We talked about places of articulation. We talked about rhotics and lateral liquids. So liquids is this natural class, but then within it is rhotic, the earth sound, and lateral, the old sound. So the book talked about smaller classes for place and articulation, or sharing. So they use terms like homotypic and homoorganic to refer to sharing manner and place. Okay, we're not going to delve into that in too much detail, but it's just important that you understand why we categorize sounds into these classes. Um, as I mentioned before, and you can see in the chart, these two major classes in manner are obstruents, so vocal constriction, airflow is being restricted, versus sonorants. And when we talked about these, we talked about as we go down this chart, the airflow becomes less and less restricted. And we're going to talk about sonorants a little bit later in the semester as well. So as you could see, nasals, liquids, and glides make up the sonorants. All other sounds are part of obstruents. Okay. Another way of describing these or categorizing them is continuance. So you could sustain the sound for a long time. So if you think about somebody singing la 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 la, right, you can sustain that sound. Non-continuance sounds can't be sustained. So if you think of a stop, you're not able to sustain that for a long period of time. Okay, so if you want to do this now, you can pause the video or you can do it later to get some practice in identifying the manner for the first and the last consonant in these rows. Okay. One more, which looks like an R. In fact, I made the mistake when I was reading it before, but it is not the letter R, it is not the sound, is the flap. So the flap, we often hear it in the medial position of words. So for example, like in the word butter, it's a very quick, right, sound. So it could either be represented orthographically in spelling with two Ds or two Ts, not always. Sometimes it's a single letter, but often it's two letters. If you want to have some comic relief, you can watch this Saturday Night Live skit, which they constantly use the word butter, and you hear the flap. So that, I think that's it for our flap. Oh, just, you will see it's in the IPA chart, listed along with the other alveolar sounds, because as you could see, it's, like an allophone of t and d in that medial position of words, okay? All right. We talked a little bit about development before, but just to kind of bring it into this discussion, on manner, stops, nasals, and glides are early developing sounds. So usually by 3 years old, not always, but usually. Mid sounds are affricates, liquids, and fricatives. And then those interdental fricatives, once again, are later developing sounds. In speech therapy, the challenging sounds, I mentioned manner is important for speech therapy. For school-age children are often in these manners. So fricatives are often being treated, affricates, and liquids. So these are the sounds that often, if the children are making errors on sounds, they don't often resolve these first. These are the ones that tend to need to be remediated in speech therapy. Okay. So that is it for this lecture. And our last lecture, it will be very short. It's going to be on voicing. And then we will be finished with learning about consonants this week. See you there.